For the first time in 3 years, the U.S. economy has contracted, marking a stark shift from the bullish growth narrative championed by the Trump administration. While the White House insists this is a manageable correction, critics warn it's a sign of deeper instability, driven in part by trade policy that's both unpredictable and politically divisive. President Trump has made tariffs a cornerstone of his economic identity, imposing sweeping 10% duties on imports and shifting positions within days. This week, the Senate narrowly blocked a resolution to reverse those tariffs, revealing cracks even within Republican ranks. Still, Trump has doubled down, claiming Americans don't need Chinese goods at all. With the world watching, questions arise. Is this just political theater, or are we witnessing a genuine policy unraveling? How sustainable is this economic strategy, and what does the signal ahead of the next election cycle? Tonight, joining us from Lisbon is political analyst Anna Evans and Pascal De Lima, chief economist at the business knowledge management consulting firm in Paris, to explore whether this contraction is a policy misfire or a calculated risk. From the capital to global markets, the implications could be far-reaching. I'm James Ezimoha, and this is Context. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Anna, let's start with you. Does this economic setback weaken Trump's central claim of being a strong economic steward?
Well, James, it depends on what will happen in the longer run, because the issue here is that the kinds of effects that this kind of policy bears upon the markets vary according to market players. So for the middle class consumer, it can mean increased prices, increased household costs, and that of course has political translations which are not good for voting, for the upcoming midterm elections. It also has economic effects in terms of businesses that import goods from China and from Chinese supply chains that go through other third countries and eventually reach the US. And so many firms in the auto sector, for example, in technologies and in other industries are faced with increasing costs because of these tariffs. And it is hard to claim that those promises that were very prominent in the electoral campaign, that the swing states that coincide with states where industries are dormant because of the Chinese competition. So one of the great claims of President Trump's electoral campaign was that swing states would fare better in terms of industrial revival and of industrial labor capacity to face expenses at the end of the month. Mm-hmm. And what we are seeing is that in turn there is economic contraction. It takes a long time for industries to revive, so this is not an immediate stimulus. Mm-hmm. And these labor classes might not see any effect except for inflation and higher prices. So I would say that there are many questions ahead on whether the United States can keep its economic leverage, and the signs are not very positive now.
Thank you. Pascal, are we looking at policy-driven decline here, or broader macroeconomic forces are at play?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. First, policy choices, of course, particularly tariffs and trade tensions. Tariffs and trade tensions have certainly contributed to the slowdown, of course, but we shouldn't ignore broader global headwinds like slowing demand in China, geopolitical uncertainty too, and maturing US business cycle. So the administration's approach may be controversial, of course, but it's also a response to genuine structural imbalance in global trade.
How deep is the Republican divide over tariffs, and could this become a campaign issue further down the line?
Is that for me?
Yes, for you, Anna.
Okay, yes, we are watching very clear signs that there is some divide at the internal party level, which of course is nothing new in American politics. American politics are characterized by what we call pork barrel politics, and so the representatives and the senators are always very mindful of the interests of their local constituencies. And so this is, again, part of the game. What we are watching here is a growing concern that the problems of inflation and what I said previously about, not having sufficient economic outcomes in swing states that signal a positive impact in economic terms of Trump's policies. This is a problem for Republican policymakers who will face midterm elections, because especially in the swing states, where this was such a very important topic for the electoral campaign, if the Republican House representatives and those members of the Senate that go to elections, some of the Senate goes to elections as well, and if they cannot show good results to their constituencies, then the tariff issue is indeed a problem. And what we have seen is that Congress is trying, although very subtly, to capture back its institutional powers in terms of trade. Congress is supposed to have very strong institutional powers in terms of approving trade legislation, and President Trump has used and overused executive powers in order to prevent the Congress from having a say. But it looks like that Congress is, softly trying to have a voice in order to prepare for the midterm elections. And the Democrats are making Republicans vote on these issues so that it is publicly registered and public knowledge that Republicans have voted either for or against the powers of the administration to proceed with the tariffs. So yes, this will be an electoral issue for sure.
Thank you. Pascal, how damaging is tariff uncertainty for investment, inflation, and supply chains?
Deepening effects. Tariff uncertainty does have deepening effects, of course. It complicates planning and adds cost. But the US economy remains resilient, and many firms are adapting. Some are reconfiguring supply chains to reduce dependency on China, which could be strategically sound in the long run. Still, the short-term frictions are real. Delayed investment, localized inflation, and logistical strains are all emerging symptoms, of course.
Now back to you, Anna. Trump says Americans don't need most Chinese imports. Is this political theater or an effective message to his base?
Well, I would say that President Trump forgot to mention that there are very different types of imports. And these very different types of imports have very different consequences for America's dependency on China. So President Trump is talking about the children's toys and saying that instead of having 30 toys to play, a child might only have 2 toys. And so that wouldn't be that much of a problem. Well, in political terms, in terms of international politics and what we call dependency, that is correct. If the US does not import T-shirts or trousers or clothes from China, the consumers may live with less T-shirts or less sweatshirts or less trousers. But this is different from, for example, rare earths or critical materials, all those materials that are needed for technology industries to operate, or for example, the auto industries, or any sort of businesses that deals with information technology. And China, unfortunately, has prepared very well for strategic self-sufficiency. So China controls a very, very large percentage of rare earths, the supply chains around the world, as well as many supply chains of critical raw materials. The United States has many of these materials, but it is much more costly to produce and extract and refine them in the US than it is in China. And so the problem is that one thing is not to import T-shirts, another thing is how to quickly switch from the imports of rare earths and critical materials that are being used either via direct imports from China or via third country imports, but originally from China, and which are very necessary for American industries. So how will the US solve this issue?
It's just interesting listening to you. Do you think it's a product of not having? I'm still with you, Anna. Competent advisors around him, Trump, that is, or it's just that he doesn't listen to people who speak to him about these issues and the implications for the American people?
Well, I think we would have to ask people in the administration, but I doubt they would be willing to answer that. I think we can add that already during President Biden's administration, there was a very clear concern with the overdependency on China with regard to critical materials. And so President Biden used industrial policy to deal with that overdependency and created, for example, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act that tried to offer industrial subsidies and benefits that aimed to stimulate production of those materials that were imported from China. But apparently this was not sufficient, and we do not know whether the trade policy that is being now implemented will work.
Pascal, do you see a growing mismatch between Trump's economic messaging and actual performance data?
Yes, there is a gap, yes, but it's not black and white, of course, and the messaging tends to focus on strong job numbers and stock performance, while data on investment, trade, and manufacturing paint a more complex picture. The administration's narrative is aimed at confidence building, which matters politically, but markets and economies are attuned to subtler signs of stress beneath the surface.
Back to you, Anna. Was the Senate's near reversal of Trump's tariffs a symbolic protest or a serious blow to his authority?
Well, I would say that it is a signal for President Trump that he needs to listen to the institutional mechanisms that the country has at hand. So, although we do not know what is happening inside the administration in itself, and a parenthesis here, we do know that there have been some cleavages that have become public between, for example, the Trade Secretary and other players inside the administration. But, but still those are leaks of information that are limited. But one thing is very clear. Trump has not been listening that much to Congress because Congress has not exerted its authority over decisions that relate to trade. So this is very objective. There are no speculations here. The administration, in this case the president, has been deciding based on executive orders, and he has passed more executive orders in the first 100 days than President Biden passed for the whole mandate. So there are no doubts on the fact that Congress has not been having a voice. So on the other hand, we can say that the fact that President Trump has suspended a number of tariffs and is negotiating bilaterally with countries, that is also a sign that although the president is not maybe sufficiently using institutional powers, the powers of the Congress, indeed there's something going on at the backstage in terms of conversations between Republican heavyweights, in terms of the legislators, and their lobbying within the administration. So although it is a fact that institutionally we do not see Congress acting as much as it should, on the other hand, there is backstage lobbying with some results already. So I would say the tariff suspensions are a result of lobbying by political actors, which include Republican lawmakers that have their heads at a price for the midterm elections.
Thank you. Pascal, what kind of long-term cost does this erratic tariff policy impose on US and global markets?
Well, the risk lies in diminishing predictability, undermining international cooperation. That said, some of the underlying goals, like challenging unfair trade practices, are legitimated. If managed with more consistency and multilateral engagement, the strategy could yield long-term benefits. But without that, the unpredictability imposes friction, deters investment, and may isolate the US from evolving global supply networks.
Anna, if the contraction continues, do you expect Trump to shift his political strategy or double down on economic nationalism?
Well, I would expect President Trump to adjust the wind sails. It's like a boat, a sailboat, and the markets are very powerful, and President Trump is a businessman to his heart and bone. And so it is not feasible to have economic contraction, long-standing, and to have the pillars of his support, both Congress people who depend on votes and the billionaires who fund the campaigns, losing money. Even Elon Musk has lost so much money. He has lost many millions, on the markets, stock market, and on Tesla sales. Tesla sales have really gone down. And so an entrepreneur like President Trump cannot withstand these kinds of market pressures that have very strong political consequences for the ones who support him, for people who support him. So he will adjust. In fact, he has started to adjust because we see the suspension on the tariffs and the bilateral dialogues, and Vice President Pence has had lunch at the Senate, and he has also mentioned and underlined and emphasized that these dialogues with trade partners are being held every day. And so it seems quite clear that there is a concern to adjust policy according to market pressures and to electoral constituencies' dictatum, because America is a democracy. China is not. So China can endure economic stringency for much longer than a democratic regime can. And President Trump knows that. So I think it will clearly be a shifting policy, adjusting to the market winds.
Pascal, can this be reversed quickly with stimulus, or are we seeing signs of deeper systemic weaknesses?
Well, I think that stimulus can help cushion the impact, particularly if targeted at infrastructure or innovation. But what we are seeing are early signs of institutional fatigue, policy uncertainty, declining global trust, and a fragmented policy agenda. So the US still has powerful tools, of course, at its disposal, but regaining momentum will require not just money, but clarity, coordination, and of course, credibility too.
Well, thank you both for sharing your insights on this important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Anna.
America's economy is now in the red, and opinions are just as divided. Whether this marks a temporary dip or a structural turning point, one thing is clear: economic power is as much about perception as performance. That was Context. Thank you for watching.